Outline of this this presentation. In the beginning, when I got assignment from Ruiz, I thought it was more like a workshop, very interactive, and I suggest that we have many presenters in this area with CDS and GDL and so on. But eventually, it turned out to be more like a presentation, a classic presentation. So I'm putting lots of material, and I intend to keep it more on the functional level, on a clinical level, that it will not be too boring for the clinicians in the audience. And there will be technical details, and we can adjust as we go. And I want to have more interactive session during this session, if it's okay with you. So I'm going to talk about, give some introduction of myself, the company I work for, and I think it's a very unique position. My work is in that context, and that gives the background of the GDO work. I'm going to talk about the scope, the design and the implementation of guideline definition language. Then I will talk about the applications of GDL in reality. Then I will have a summary and a question session. About myself, and it's striking that yesterday when I listened to Ian's presentation, I was thinking about myself, and it's very interesting that we have several person like us, with similar background from medicine, comes to IT, computer science, and gets stuck in this thing called medical informatics. And we have several variations, maybe longer clinical practice or longer system development. But it's all very similar that we have the same aim, which is about how to improve healthcare with IT. And this is interesting in a way that there are many people before us in the health informatics community that lay a foundation for us, that it's possible for us to make some improvements and some breakthroughs. My background is thoracic surgeon. I haven't finished my specialization before I jump into health informatics. I've done quite extensive system software development. I have been leading the OpenEHR Java implementation from OpenEHR for years. And recently, I've been appointed as the director of the OpenAir Foundation. And I did my PhD in semantic interoperability. That's one that gets into OpenEHR. And today, I'm also co-supervising master thesis and PhD students at the Karolinska Institutet. And lastly, I'm the responsible person for health informatics at Cambio, with a strong focus on clinical decision support and knowledge management. So about the company I work for, I've been with Cambio for 8 years now, so it's a really long time. And the company has been around for more than 20 years. It's a company, software company specialized in regional electronic health record systems. We have market share in Denmark, Sweden, and UK. So we're an international company, and we have standard product for all three markets. And that is quite remarkable, if you think about it. There are not many us can succeed in doing that, create one product that fits different market. Another thing unique with Cambio is that our product covers the entire region. So in entire health, regional population that we cover primary care, we cover hospital care, we cover regional hospitals with single system, single configuration. And that is, I think, very unique when you think about the setup of healthcare and how systems today are deployed. And that gave us a tremendous leverage when we develop things like knowledge management and clinical decision support. And that has some impact on my work, actually, in CDS and knowledge management. And this is our largest customer in Denmark, it's Region South. roughly has 20% of Danish population. In its single instance, we started with Odense University Hospital, which is supposed to be the largest university hospital, and they are still deploying Cosmic towards the rest of the region now. And in Sweden, we have more typical installation that covers 500,000 population with regional hospital or university hospital than with 30, 40 or 70 primary care centers in the same installation. So that is the context I work from, and we need to support standard product that is scalable through different customers cross-country borders, and we need to support specialized care at a hospital, but also primary care and care at rehab centers, regional hospitals and so on. And that gives us lots of constraints when it comes to CES. Let's just put Cambio aside for a moment. I'm going to go back to the Cambio work in the later part of the presentation, but look at this old hypothesis about around CEHR. And this is some proposition from informatics researchers in the early days of electronic health record system. And the basic idea is that with introduction of electronic health record system, we can move information and knowledge much quicker than we could do with analog, with paper-based records. And that was almost 20 years old proposition. And still today, I think the sad truth is that lots of the promises, lots of the ambition are not fulfilled. And the basic idea is quite simple. How many of you have seen this before? This division of healthcare in three, so not many of you. I will try to explain the idea here. If you look at medicine as a whole industry, a whole domain, roughly can divide this into three subdomains. On the right up corner, you have the research domain, where the knowledge are discovered and updated, and they're driven by clinical trials, quality registries, and so on to find new knowledge. Basically, researchers, they publish their results through peer-review articles, conference, and so on. And those knowledge, they are aggregated and written down as practice protocols and guidelines and so on. Then you have this very long education, or sometimes called knowledge dissemination cycle, for it to reach the point of care, where you meet patients. And I put answer there. Usually I ask the question, how long does it take for best evidence to reach the point of care? It takes not in number of weeks, months, it's actually years. I don't know what do you take on this, but for me, as someone coming from the medicine part side in the beginning, I think this is very depressive. Taking years for something that's based on evidence that we know something could save patients' life, but takes years for this knowledge to get the point of care. And that's not part of the story. It's just part of the problem, but this is not the whole story. As soon as the clinician are aware of the latest knowledge at the point of care, it still takes lots of effort to apply that knowledge at practice. Imagine yourself as a primary care physician. You have this old lady in front of you. You only have 10 minutes for that visit. This old lady has 8 to 10 conditions, chronic conditions, previous surgery, and she has a long list of medication, and she's complaining of bad sleep she had last night. So you have only 10 minutes. Look over this old lady, and she come in for refilling of diabetic drug or some flu drugs or something. And that's the encounter with this old lady. You have to go through all the records and look at most prominent problems. So in that situation, do you think it's possible to make consistent clinical decision and applying the latest evidence for the care of this old lady? I think it's impossible. We have long past the moment that we have to rely on human effort to make consistent decision use latest knowledge, in the constraints. We're humans, we make mistakes, we're fatigued, we easily get distracted. We have lots of things at hand, we have limited time to provide the best care we can afford. And that's where the CDS, the classic CDS, come into place, with the promise to improve adherence to evidence-based guideline and facilitate decision-making at the point of care when we meet patients. That's where the intervention is provided to patients. So when you do that, you generate clinical outcomes, good or bad, lab investigation, diagnosis, and progress notes, and so on. And those information has to be used to generate new updates of knowledge. That's equally important as the first arm of the iteration. And it goes on and on. If you have new updates, you want to disseminate that knowledge, and you have to rely on this dissemination process. Then you want to apply this knowledge at the point of care. So this is the basic challenges we're facing together. Not just clinicians are facing this challenge, but as IT vendors, as health informaticians and researchers in the area. And I start to say more and more, I mention this kind of ideas in Cambio, at Cambio, which is an IT company. We historically kind of distant ourselves from the clinicians. We think, we're an IT company, we focus on software, we talk about database normalization level, scalability, transaction, and so on. But that doesn't mean anything to a clinician. If you grab a clinician, average clinician, ask about, what do you think about the database normalization level? They don't give, they don't care about that. They care about patient safety, efficacy, and efficiency of care. And they care about this. And they want to apply their evidence at the point of care when the evidence is ready, and they want to get help when they fall into cracks of mistakes. So something is catching that patient. Before we move on, any comments on this slide?
Where does the 17 years come from? Is that measured by somebody?
It's actually published in literature. I have seen the reference. I just lazy not putting the reference there. But it's published the report. Yeah. But I think, if you look at oncology, cardiology, maybe even neurology, these areas are moving much faster. So they have updates like half year, every year. Then those specialists, they are more prone to follow guidelines. They are more scientific. But in other areas like primary care area, that's impossible. How can you count on a primary care physician to follow all the guidelines in different specialties? That's just impossible. I was recently interviewing a cardiologist who's supposed to be the leading authority of AF, atrial fibrillation, in Sweden, in Europe for that matter. And he told me that he's a cardiology professor. He's very familiar with AF, the recent updates and so on. But if you ask him about heart failure, he doesn't know about the latest development. So we are seeing sub-specialization of certain area. We're going deeper and more specialized in medicine. And we're going to see more and more of this problem. The GPs, they will never be able to catch up on all the trends in each of different specialization. So we need some kind of system to aid decision-making, to catch errors, and to disseminate knowledge as quick as possible, and to meet the feedback loop. And there's something about quality registry here. I think it's a very popular thing in Nordic countries. In Sweden, in particular, we have 80 national registries, single condition-based registries. And of course, it generates tremendous value for the society. But on the other hand, the users, they are not happy with that. Because all these registry, they require not double, but triple and multiple entries to satisfy the need of the quality registries. And so you don't get high quality of data. It's very error prone. Then you have incomplete coverage. And that is dangerous. Because if you have a quality register, supposed to be the national registry for entire Sweden, you only cover the population that meet in the hospitals. You don't know what's happening in the GP. You get a misleading picture. You see the tip of the iceberg, but you don't see the whole picture. So that's it. That's sort of the challenge we're facing. And put that into the context of Cambio in Sweden. We want to accelerate this through the use of semantic technology and the electronic health record system. So that's something we want to achieve, with GDL, with archetypes, with the technology we have today. So this is basically what we want to achieve. We want to have computerized decision support for decision support at the point of care, and we want to catch those errors. It doesn't have to be very complex decision making. I hear that from clinicians, many times that they really enjoy complex decision making that really require, craftsmanship in medicine. But they do need help in more boring tasks, repetitive work. Just, follow the guideline, do this, a small number of things you have to go through the checklist. And when they make a mistake, the system has to be there to catch that. If you prescribe morphine 10 times more than normal, somewhere, some logic has to catch that error before it hits the patient. And we also want to establish feedback system. Because if you don't know about the reality, if you can't quantify what's the reality, what's the compliance rate, what's the quality measurements, how can you talk about improvement? Remember, we talk about the improvement of patient safety, improvement of efficacy, but where are the measurements? So we want to measure that. And in the same way that you can measure with the quality registry, but minus the manual, double entry, triple entry, and so on. We want to measure based on production data we do have today in large regional systems. And of course, it's a mix of, unstructured and structured data, but we do have huge amount of structured data over a long period and on the regional level. And we want to enable comparison between specialties, across regions, and to create this sense of peer pressure so the practitioner, can follow the guidelines. We want to share logic, clinical decision support logic. And if we develop something with Uppsala in Sweden, we want to take the same decision support system to Odense in Denmark, or maybe to Oslo in Norway, without changing any of the clinical logic. And most of our CDS projects are based on international guidelines. And it's international guidelines, European Society of Cardiology guidelines, the international knowledge about medicine. It's not controversial. It's not very controversial to have agreement on some basic things. So that's the context of our informatics CDS, and more specifically, guideline definition language work, which started about 2 years from now. I think I made a GDO presentation about a year ago in this very room. So some of you might have heard the next session about the GDO implementation and design and so on. So this is our starting point. As a system vendor with market share, quite substantial market share in Denmark, Sweden, and UK, we want to enter decision support area. We want to find a technology, informatics standards that can fulfill that list of requirements, and there's none. There's no specification, mainstream formalism, or guideline representation model that can fulfill this list of requirements. And I was bold enough to propose, to present this and propose the question to many of the leading authorities in the area, in CDS, guideline community, and so on. And we have agreement that there's no single technology can fulfill this requirement. It's very sad. The research and development of CDS has been as long as that of EHR system. And from the 70s, 80s, there are lots of hype around CDS and so on. But still today, we cannot find a single technology fulfill that requirement. And I would like to, elaborate on some of them. We're looking at a formal language that we can execute within the system, a machine-readable format with a proper object model behind it. We look for something that is natural language independent, that the logic will be expressed in a formal way, that we can add language labels, Chinese, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish as we go, without disrupting the logic. And we want to have, given the reality, we can't bet everything on Snowman City, even though I heard fantastic things about Snowman City and so on. But the reality is that we have ICD-10 to deal with, we have ATC codes, we have ICF, we have ICD-9 in some countries. That's the reality. And I don't want to wait a couple of years more for Snowman City to be ready, to be used by our users, to do any of CDS. I want to do CDS now. So I want to introduce some independency towards reference terminology, as well as natural language. And we want to have some independency towards the EHR model. And this is interesting, a proposition from me working for one specific EHR system vendor. And the reasoning behind this is that it's actually very straightforward. Think about our product development. We have evolving target as the EHR model internally as well. So for my benefit of my operation around CDS and so on, I want to have an expressive model which is somehow flexible and stable enough so I can put logic on top of that. And even better is that if I go to a new emerging market where our EHR system is not on the ground, I can map the expressive model I have towards the local EHR model. It can be any vendor system, proprietary models. So that explains why I want to have the model independency. We limit the scope. If you look at some guideline representation model, they have very wide scope. But our scope for GDL is very limited. We want to support single decision making, because we see lots of potential even in simple areas. Like calculating mu score, calculate eGFR, do a dosing check. Simple things. So we want to do simple things in the first place and really help to improve patient safety. But on the other hand, we want to make possible to change these single decision-making rules into more complex decision support. So that's not contradictory to each other, right? Support single decision-making with each of the artifact, but then having the possibility to link these things in a more complex situation. And we leave out process support from the scope of GDL for now. Then there's maintainability, reusability. It's crucial for us, so we can mix different rules for different contexts, different applications. And we want to have somehow independency towards the technical platform. Any challenges, any comments before move on? Yes, please.
It's really a comment to the previous slide. If you could,
Yeah.
You said agnostic to natural language and natural language.
Sorry, it must be a typo then. Yeah, sorry. It is what I meant is agnostic natural language and the reference terminology. Sorry about that. Yeah. So these are two different things. One is for the human interaction, on the user interface. You have a user interface terminology. That's one type of terminology we're dealing with, the labels for human to read. Then you have another thing called the reference terminology. That's where you do the reasoning about, if pneumonia is infectious thing on the site of lung. So you do proper reasoning, logical reasoning. So these are two different things. And we want to have independency in the rules, towards these two areas. Yeah. Shall we move on? Yeah, yes, please.
As long as the GDL is only supported by one vendor, how far can you go then?
That's interesting comment. Yes, I actually very practical about the measurements of success of all this kind of technology. I look at the commercial penetration. Of course, I care about research papers, all these research groups and so on. But ultimately, What matters is clinical benefits achieved by large commercial system. And our aim is actually to promote implementation on, with GDO through, implementation community, vendor systems. And I know DIPS is very interested in GDL. I know the Korean system implementing GDL. There are lots of research teams. There may be spin-off companies. I don't know, but it's still early days. That's why I said in the beginning it's a start of exciting journey, and we see lots of interest around these things, and we choose to be open. We make the specification openly available. We made open source software behind this. So the entire implementation of the GDO model and the execution and the linking to rule engine are open source software.
Thank you.
Thanks. So we have a list of requirements, and I hope that everyone will agree with me at this point that we made a good decision to invent something new to fulfill this requirement. So we didn't look very far. We actually look at one classic paper from Alan Rector and colleagues from Manchester University. It's a paper from 2001. And interestingly, just recently, we have a consortium called Semantic Health Net. We have a group of experts involving CDS, and this paper has been brought up again, and to discuss, this is something really can be considered best approach when we approach CDS and guideline models and so on. So the idea is quite straightforward, that when you have to do some reasoning about health data and medical data, there are three distinctive models. And this is a model, itself is a model, abstraction. There will be complexity, that when you implement these things. But the foundation is really simple. You have three different kind of models that you have to deal with. The first model is the information model. That's about patient. It's an instance of patient. Mr. Anderson has certain blood pressure, and it's measured at certain time points. So that's an instance about a certain patient. That always that information comes from the EHR. So that's why the model is from the EHR model. And you have something called concept model. And today it's an area covered by reference terminology like ICD-10 and SNOMED and so on. Now you have the inference model, which is sometimes I describe as a foreground knowledge of medicine. If you practice internal medicine, the guideline of diabetic treatment, evolve over time. If you're a cardiologist, you follow cardiology guidelines, in AF management and so on. So this is fast evolving medical knowledge. If you look at this side, the concept model, that's slow moving part of the medicine. That's what you pick up at medical school. For me, it goes through medical school, then I forgot most of the things by now, but I still remember lots of things from pathology, human anatomy, disease classification, these things. These are the slow-moving things, and therefore we use different technology and different group of experts working in different areas. So the basic idea from Aaron Rector's paper is that we need interfaces between all these three principal models. And by the time we started our GDO work, we have a pretty good idea of the information model. We have our choice of technology, which is OpenEHR. And this is not the only choice. You can use, other EHR models as you prefer. But we're comfortable with OpenEHR and think we believe it's the most expressive technology that we are comfortable with. And in this area, it's basically, it's the reference terminology. We just pick whatever that is on the ground, what is available. And we still have some question marks around the inference model, how to codify, how to computerize fast-evolving foreground knowledge from the practice guidelines. And so that's where we get started. This is our theoretical foundation. Any questions? Following slides will be more explaining how we implement the theoretical ideas into working software. Okay, let's move on. Yes.
Can you elaborate a little
Okay.
What does it
I hope I know the answer. I have my interpretation. I'm not 100% sure if it's the view from Alan's paper, but there's a series of papers, from, this is the first one. There's a follow-up in 2003, I think, and 2007. And he's still active, you can ask him about the interpretation here. But I think what he meant here is that these things are fast evolving. And then you have the temporal constraints, it's dynamic handling of activities, steps. It's like process handling, that you have all these steps you have to go through, and there are logical decisions you have to make along the way. And we haven't solved everything that on this picture. We just solved a tiny bit part we called single decision making with the GDL. And of course, it's a journey for us. We want to put process language on top of that, and we want to go, the full length eventually. So, if we turn Alan Rector's theoretical paper into our design, what we want to achieve really is not to reinvent things that are already in place. For instance, the EHR model, the reference terminology, or any rule expression language, because the first predicate rules has been around, for as long as the early days of computer science. You have lots of established rule engines, industry strength rule engine, the ones used by NASA, by defense projects and so on. So we're not into reinvent those core technology. So what we want to do here is introduce a minimal GRU language. I don't know if you heard of that expression. I think it may be our invention here, a GRU language. We glue things together, link things from the EHR model, the reference terminology, and existing rule language to design a small language so we can kind of link these three artifacts together. And this is what we have achieved with the GDL. So I will try to explain these three design principles. The first one is how we can bind interesting data points in archetypes towards the rule expression. Because you want to express something, let's say EGFR, estimated renal function of the patient based on creatinine values and height, weight, and gender and age and so on. To use those parameters from this is body weight archetype. But you're only interested in data points where the numeric value of weight is expressed in archetype. So you pick the archetype ID and the path. That combination will be unique enough to give us a handler towards that archetype and use that handle in our rule expression. So in that expression, in the rule language, we can use the GT code. It's a code that is neutral to language as a replacement of the ID and the path. And that's the thing we know about weight number measurement in the weight archetype. And we use that strictly in expressions, and we can add translations to that as we go. And the idea that we don't want to use the expression from the archetype as serious is that we want to introduce possibility, flexibility for user to override a label coming from the archetype. But in the editing, actually, you can take that as default, the label from the archetype for this element by default. But you can override that as well. So this single design choice actually fulfilled two core requirements: independency towards EHR model in open archetype format, and independency towards natural language. That gives a point to bind natural language labels. Feel free, I will not ask a question, just feel free to interrupt me if you feel lost, if you want to have some quick comment. Sure.
A very small question. What happens if you have more than one value for the GT0005? I mean, in the rule.
What do you mean by two values?
You have two values at that path. in your data instances, you may have two values for the weight.
Two values from weight.
Yeah, I know it doesn't make sense in this particular example, but you can have two values.
If you're thinking about choice in the ADL, you can choose specific data value type at the element level. Is that what you meant?
No, I mean you may have a multi-value attribute, so you may have.
Yeah. So in this way, we rely on the OpenEHR archetype methodology. We have to have unique element, unique value from certain binding point, and we're not into reinvent things. We have to rely on the, if this doesn't work, it's Thomas, to blame. I'm not interested in reinvent anything to address the general problem from OpenEHR. It has to work. In the queries, in the string support logic, if that, that's the basic proposition. If this doesn't work, then there's no point of using archetypes. So that's my basic assumption. And so far, we haven't reached any problems. And of course, there are corner cases, as you said. One, it's not specific that there's certain choice on the element level, with the values and so on. You might get different values and so on. But so far, we have been avoiding, delaying this problem by using templates. So made explicit on a template level, this is the path we want to have, and this is the value we want to have. So we pinpoint to that element. Yes, Thomas?
It might be worth adding that the way you see these tasks,
it may be that we have to be a bit more serious in adding X query, X path semantics. We use them pretty heavily, and some of it is published in the specifications as they are now, but I don't think it covers enough of the semantics that are there. But most people seem to assume that it will be, you could use the same sort of syntax as in X query and X path, which I think it still seems to me the obvious way to go. I think that this work is going to be maybe the one that tests it out, more heavily. So what Alberto just said is, I suspect if you either had a time series of measurements or just different measurements of weight, I think you probably have a separate mechanism for deciding what data set to use. That's obviously a different
We have
question.
temporal constraints. We have predicates for predicting, which diagnosis to use. Because you have the same diagnosis archetype, and that's just a class. Then we can pinpoint at which diagnosis to look at.
Right.
And we also have a predicate that we can put, simple conditions for to pick the element out.
I mean, a more complex version of this might have been to embed an entire AQL query in there, which, I don't know that I would have done that either. I think it's simpler to go for the path and keep things separated out into layers. But I don't think a priori there's likely to be any problem in, getting exactly the thing you want, as long as you assume that in some cases there might have to be a bit of extra X query-like syntax in the, the predicate, the square bracket expressions.
Yeah. We did think about, embedding AQL directly in the binding here. The way we choose to go here is, partly because of readability, to improve the readability of GDL, document. Because in the beginning we didn't have an editor, we have to use a plain text editor. But the second reason is that somehow there's cases that, probably not 100 supported by the AQL. We want to express what we want. We don't want to, write a query to solve that. So it's a kind of different mentality, and of course, in our runtime environment, we do generate AQL queries to run these things. So it's 100% automated. Yes, please.
As far as I understand, or maybe you'll be coming to it later on, when I look at this slide, what I see is that you, in a way, repeat the term, the weight, about the weight. Mm. The next question to me would be, what is the decision when you're given these terms and these values? What is the decision? That's one question. And the other question is, when you develop rule languages, you would normally think about a forward chaining or a backward chaining.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something you consider? Or?
Yeah. We use standard rule engine, in this system, and I think in a way it's forward chaining logic. And in this particular, the decision is actually about what will be the calculated GFR based on height and weight. So it's a simple calculation. But if we have compliance checking, then the result is if this is compliant or not. If you have multiple rules like that, you can chain these things in forward chaining decision. So you have more complex decision. I will have a slide in the later part of the presentation, provide a big picture of entire CDS application, how these rules fit together. This is just a simple case with a calculation. There are more complex examples that we can build on top of that. These are just building blocks for us. So moving on, we have the second design that we use a simple, straightforward expression language, partly based on what's available already in OpenEHR. We extend a little bit for assignment and so on. And the way we put our conditions and the statements are very much like the mainstream rule language. We have when and then statements, where priority we can map easily to existing rule language support. So it's not really controversial. We use the common operators, and so all these things are possible to read. But it's again as long as we have a more powerful editors, these things are not really meant to be read by human. Here we have third principle. It's about terminology binding, reference terminology binding, and here we can bind, for instance, local GT codes, which is supposed to be the heart failure diagnosis, a heart failure condition, towards external terminology. It can be ICD-10, SNOMED CT, or any local terminology codes that you use in your EHR system. And the benefit is obvious that when we do the expression like this, we don't have to change the codes when we have a new customer or we have a new site that run a different terminology system. And that lack of terminology support in the rule expression is one of the barriers for scalable CDS logic. And another one is the EHR model. So we tackle this problem. And again, this design is actually borrowed from OpenEHR. It's really we benefit tremendously because from the existing design from OpenEHR. So it's a pattern that we take from OpenEHR. So put these things together. We do have published a document called GDO Design, and it's a very thin document because we reused lots of design principles, design specification from OpenEHR, like the path, like the identification of the archetype, and the metadata, around the authorship, release, change management, and the term definitions, terminology bindings, and so on. And the only thing we extended, based on the OpenEHR specification, are these three areas. And so if you look at the object model, which is a proper object model that we implement in Java now, it's actually very, very small. It's the main classes are just a handful of classes, 5 classes. So it's not a very big design. So, and the blue ones are existing OpenEHR design that we take from the OpenEHR Java implementation. So for us, it's a small design, and we use existing rule engine. And the one we work with is from JBoss Group. It's called JBoss Rules. It's a popular one in the Java community. And I imagine it would be very easy to do similar things with ilog, JS, other rule engine. And we really believe that this will benefit the community as a whole, because there's a need for such design, and I think we borrowed a lot from OpenEHR. We want to contribute back. So roughly, I think it was a year ago, we made the release through OpenEHR, and we made some updates of the guidelines, and we have our open source repository on GitHub. So we have open source software behind this. This is the editor. You can go to the GitHub to download the whole source code, and SourceForge to download the binary. So I'm going to quickly go through the editor, just give a big picture, on how it looks like. But I'm not going to details to explain different parts of the GDO editor. I think we have written a manual and samples for that. And last year we had the tutorial at MIE in Copenhagen about the GDO, and it was quite popular. So this is the editor. When you load a GDO guideline, you have the first view describe what is the guideline. You have the description, the purpose, the use, misuse, and you have references, authorship, life cycle, and so on. It's identical to those of our archetype. So if you work a lot in the open air community, you recognize them immediately. It's very useful, when you have to index your knowledge artifacts. For instance, that if we later to publish these things through CKM, for instance, these things will be used as a common, tagging or indexing mechanism for rules and archetypes. And here we have the bindings, how they look like in the archetype, in the GDO editor. And for instance, we have multiple diagnosis, evaluation diagnosis archetypes, and we bind them into different elements we can use in GDO with predicates with terminology bindings. So we can pinpoint at if the patient has AF diagnosis, if the patient has heart failure diagnosis, and so on. And we're building more predicates, temporal constraints, numeric constraints, and so on. Here's the view of list of rules, and some of the rules are really, really straightforward and almost deceptively simple when you look at the rules. And that helped me a lot. When I bring my laptop, sit side by side with the clinicians, I go through the rules with them. That's what I do. I evaluate them, and I use, Swedish. I switch back to English when I sit with my developers. This is a very powerful tool to get knowledge acquisition. Of course, I read guidelines. Of course, my developers read guidelines, but it's ultimately the clinician who has to, verify this. And there's another powerful feature in this editor that you can simulate. You can run the rule. You can execute the rule and take input from, interactively from the user to verify and validate the rule. And that is a very useful feature when you sit with a clinician for validation. So this is a view of the rule, single rule definition. So you see that the guide, when you work with a certain case, it's called a guide. That's the object model behind a single artifact in GDO. A guide consists of multiple rules that are relevant to each other. They use same bunch of archetypes and templates and bindings and so on. So this is a rule that is part of a guide. And this specific one, we set the hypertension components in the diagnosis review of for stroke prevention purpose. So you take diagnosis from the EHR system, you see, you check the temporal constraints, and then you set a component to the outcome archetype. And this is interesting. This is very important to know that everything comes into GDO rule execution and coming out from GDO execution are archetypes. So archetypes are the both input and output. We use, only that for connecting rules, connecting EHR. And there's tremendous, leverage in that because we can build a very dynamic system. We can forward chaining the rules how far as we want. Here's the screenshot of user interface. As you can see, we can easily add user interface labels to this. Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, as we call. This particular one is English one. And for production system, we have Swedish labels loaded to the CDS system. And not only the labels, but also the metadata, they are grouped by language codes. So you can have, English, Swedish metadata about the purpose, misuse. And this one's Chinese. I always show off this one. For GFR calculation. And and you can easily select the language in the editor. And not only that, but in the expression, the language labels are used to make the expression here more readable to clinicians in the natural language. So if you have an expression that is complicated to explain, you can use the natural language in Swedish. And actually, what's stored in the artifact is the machine-readable format, and that one is based on codes. So that's not something we don't bring. We don't require the clinician to review. So the same logical expression is reused across the language. And here is the view of reference terminology binding. That's where we have, if we bind this towards a more proper ontology-based terminology like Snowman City, then we can do a bit of reasoning. Yes, please.
Could you go back to the previous slide? Well, when I look at the expression, I'm still looking for the decision.
Yes.
in what you're showing.
Yeah. If I go back, this is a decision. So you have conditions, you have actions. So you take, for instance, in the GFR calculation, you take height, weight, age, and gender, and creatinine value, lab test value as input. So the action is the calculation of the EAGFR, estimated GFR. You can do similar, with the compliance checking. You can do risk calculation. So if you do all these steps, you can manage a single decision making by chaining all these smaller things.
Could you show, now I can see the condition and actions. Can you show the decision as well?
This action is the decision, yeah.
The actions are the decision.
Yes.
Okay.
It's similar, in the rule that you have condition, you have the action, yeah, or the result. So that's the terminology binding, and that's the serialization in DADL. And for us, it's just that we're comfortable to work with this serialization format. It can be XML. We're actually in production system, we use JSON now because we have RESTful API towards the knowledge manager server. So we use RESTful. But in the authoring phase, we use DADL. We have the parser array, we have the object model, and so on. So that's actually the last slide. I'm going to talk about the GDL design and implementation. Any questions before we move on to the applications of GDL? Yes.
Okay.
And 2 questions, then we move on. Yeah.
You said that the output is an archetype. Do you have available in any of the slides the archetype instances?
Yes.
Output of. Okay.
I have a slide that behind the stroke prevention CDS that's showing all the templates, archetypes, and the rules side by side.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the question is there any dependence on the language or to the opener reference model exclusively?
Yes. And that's unfortunately the truth. We have to rely on one reference model. And since we're the maintainer of the Java implementation, and we have lots of years working with OpenAir, so this specific implementation is based on the OpenEHR reference model. And last year we get the same question from maybe different groups. How can support 13606? And in principle, if you look at abstract level, design level, the GDO design is independent of the reference model. We could actually achieve that, but it only means that we have to add another indirection. So we have to internal kind of information model, then we map to any reference model. Maybe it's feasible, but again, for us, working this very tight, projects and so on, we want to move on to the real application, the real benefits. So for us, we think OpenAir is good enough, and we have to move on. And we get lots of archetype support from the community. Yeah, so it's a practical choice. It's not really very theoretical. Yeah, let's move on. And I have 30 minutes or so left, I guess. Oh, yeah. Good. So let's talk about applications of GDL. Keep in mind, GDL is just a key component in our CDS knowledge management development, and we use lots of OpenEHR extensively in the design, and the basic design kind of high-level functionality we want to achieve is that we want to start somewhere called knowledge management. We want to computerize narrative knowledge from clinical guidelines with structured templates, archetypes, and predicate rules with GDO format, and and try to host them centrally, and we can share these things across our regions. So that's the first thing we want to do, and we categorize them under knowledge management. But it's several things, archetype authoring, templates authoring, rule authoring, and sharing of knowledge, and maintain them over time, keep them in sync with published narrative guidelines. And that's one area we call knowledge management. It's very similar to what you're doing now in Norway, but we also aim at more dynamic rules and so on. So that's what we have today. We have a knowledge manager. It's not for reviewing and so on. It's more for the runtime support, listing the rules through simulation and so on. So based on that, we want to have a capacity to connect the rules and knowledge artifacts to our production data as is and give feedback. And the reasoning behind this is that given what we have in Sweden, in Nordic countries, we have lots of quality registries, and we know they're delayed, they are incomplete coverage, of the population. We want to do something much more rapid with more or less 100% coverage, and we know we can do that. And we have, regional data that covers primary care physician, primary care population, and the hospital population, and we have the possibility to run this kind of feedback. So that's something. The second thing we want to achieve, and we're still not settled with the name, but let's say dashboard, some kind of feedback system for monitoring what's going on in the reality, patient safety events, treatment compliance, quality indicators, and so on. But it's very flexible, and you can ask all kinds of questions. And eventually, if you identify certain problem, quality problem, and treatment compliance, something you want to follow up, you want to improve, we want to deploy real-time CDS at the point of care as intervention. So we start with knowledge management, computerized knowledge, up-to-date evidence-based knowledge. We measure, we provide intervention. So effectively, we have a closed-loop feedback system for improvement, for healthcare improvement in terms of patient safety and efficacy. We pinpoint what are the weak problems, and we provide intervention at the point of care on the entire region, and we follow this up. Once the protocol has changed here, we update once with our knowledge artifacts in the computerized format, and we deploy. Not in numbers of years, but in number of days and weeks and months. Does that make sense? So that's our high-level design, and we believe, and this is actually not what we believe, but we achieved in the last 2 years. This is what we have done now. We have a generic architecture based on strong, robust informatics, enable us to monitor the population on the regional setting and to provide intervention as quick as we can. And of course, the clinicians, the care professionals, they're always in the loop when we deploy such systems. They are the ones that make decision, which guideline goes forward and which monitoring should we put in place. So I just want to comment the question from a doctor from previous, the comments from previous presentation. What is in there for me? So what is in there for the clinicians? And I think this is what makes sense for them. Yes. Okay.
EHR systems, right?
This is what we can do with the EHR system, but in my knowledge that very few can do this, in the near real-time fashion. And this has been done with quality registries, but with 1-2 years delay and incomplete coverage. So we want to change the status quo by providing full regional coverage and very very quick updates.
Because what I was wondering is that when you have the rules, say the kidney failure thing, and you had the physician gets like a decision support. You should do this, or it indicates something. And if the clinician decides not to do that because of something,
contraindication,
do you monitor to what degree the physicians actually follow the rules?
Yes, I mean the system is open-ended. It depends how you construct your rules, your observation, your indicators. We can construct rules to monitor on a compliance level, but we can also monitor the reason they deviate. And this is what we do in the stroke prevention in AF. We measure the compliance, but we also measure how long does the decision take in average, and what are the reasons they deviate. Because we have control on both sides. We have control on the documentation side, which are the archetypes and templates. We give the clinician templates to make a decision about stroke prevention in AF and document if you have to deviate. Patient preference, contraindication, or maybe I have to delay because I wait for lab tests and so on. So these things are documented in a structured way, which means then we can measure that in the outcome. So we go hand in hand. If you start with unstructured, there's nothing you can measure. But you start with one thing, you can measure one thing. And again, the same question to clinician: why? What's in there for me? I spend all my time doing the structured documenting instead of dictating. But now you start to see the benefit.
Thanks.
Thanks. So I'm going to draw, experience from this cardiology example. And I'm sorry that this is the example I mentioned the last time. But the main point here is not about this case, not AF or heart failure or osteoporosis or sepsis and so on. The main thing is about that we can achieve this kind of monitoring and decision support on a generic level. And this is just one case. This is the most advanced case we're developing with our customer. The whole technology, the whole informatics stack is neutral to anything I'm going to talk about in the coming slides. So AF, it's the most common arrhythmia in the heart. It's in atrium, and prevalence is somewhere about 2.9 to 4% in the general population. And it goes very high towards 10-15% in elderly population. The main problem with AF is that it introduces strokes, infarction in the brain. And the strokes caused by AF are more severe, more subtle than strokes caused by any other conditions. And we know consistently that 25% of strokes are caused by AF. 25% of strokes. And we know in Sweden we spend 6.7 billion in stroke care. 6.7 billion. No, actually, it has to be more than that. Sorry about that. It's I think it's around 12 billion kroner for stroke care. And we know a big portion of that, more than 25% of that, goes to strokes caused by AF. So it's a big condition that, it's very kind of popular. I used the wrong term here probably, but it catch attention. It's a stroke. It's a very important condition to work with, and the main thing in management of AF is stroke prevention. And there's clearly evidence that you need to manage AF, you need to prevent stroke in the AF management. And the evidence is there, So we have a project, start from 2012, I think, and we're using 2010 version of European Society of Cardiology based on high strength of evidence from clinical trial, when recommended oral anticoagulation. So what kind of knowledge we're dealing with? And there is a 200-page of narrative document published on the European level from 2010. This is the corporate, extract from that guideline. There's an instrument called ChartVask. Basically, it's a risk stratification for stroke risks in AF patient by combining age, gender, and number of diagnoses as risk factors. So this is the English version from the USC guideline. I have the identical version in Swedish, and I picked this up when I was out meeting the primary care physicians. It's a laminated card, this size. I guess most of you have seen this. So it's there laying on the desk. It's one of several on the desk that the GP is having. And even so, this is the identical copy of the knowledge from the ESC guideline. And here, there's even recommendation on treatment. So if the risk score is 1, you can give warfarin or aspirin as anticoagulation, oral anticoagulation treatment. And if it's more than 2 or equals to 2, you always give warfarin. So that is actually in the guideline as well from 2010. So what has happened is that in the course of the project, when I work with a cardiologist, there's a new update from the European Society of Cardiology in 2012. It's about 1.5 years the guideline has been updated. In that guideline, aspirin is no longer recommended. The thing in stroke prevention in AF is a balance between efficacy of stroke prevention in AF, but also a balancing between the efficacy, but also major bleeding risks events in the brain, in the digestive systems, and so on. So it's a balance, and the major risk, the bleeding risk, can be life-threatening. So you have to balance these two things, and there are high-profile clinical trials on multiple sites give evidence that ASA doesn't protect the patient enough, but cause same amount of bleeding risks. I say that again. It causes same amount of bleeding risk, but doesn't provide benefits in stroke prevention. So the evidence is so strong that they pull out ASA from the recommendation. So in clinical trial, you have highest level of evidence based on randomized trial from different sites, and that's the highest level. And they revised the guideline in that ASA is no longer recommended. But I can guarantee you today, I'm out visiting the same primary care offices. Some of them will still have this paper-based laminated card on the desk. And even more, that some of them remember vaguely in the back of their brain that ASA is valid treatment. If I have an old lady, very frail, warfarin is too strong for her, let's give ASA. And what do you know the cardiologist will say? It's worse than a placebo. Placebo doesn't give you the effect. It's actually harming the patient by providing ASA. That's where we get very low compliance today in Sweden. When you look at the national compliance of the guideline, the knowledge has moved so rapidly. And the GPs, the primary care physicians, the doctors, non-cardiology specialists, they are still stuck in 2-year-old knowledge. And that's the reality we're talking about. And I can guarantee you, this sort of situation is not, specific to cardiology. It's across the medicine. And we're going to see more and more of this. The updates of knowledge is getting quicker and quicker, and we can never rely on manual dissemination and applying these things based on human effort. It simply will not work. I hope we can agree on this proposition. But this is the reality we're facing in this specific project. So what we did is that, and another background information is that last year, the Swedish government has said that, AF is causing so much strokes for the society, it's really, really bad. Let's reach 80% of compliance in the national level. This is part of ongoing development in Sweden called open comparison. I know some of you may have heard of it. They have public reports, documents, a website comparing healthcare outcome in all major regions and compare them. This is one of them. Anticoagulation of AF patients in stroke prevention treatment. So they want to set the goal of 80%. Do you know what's on the national level of compliance on the national level? Can someone guess, please? 20. That's pretty low. Yeah. It's 42. Yeah, it's based on a National Registry paper published from last year. It's 42, and so there's tons of, in terms of improvement, it's huge difference there. And some estimate there's 3,000 preventable strokes every year in Sweden if we can reach 75% of compliance. 3,000 of them. And I think most of them would die actually the first year and have long-term disability. So this is sort of situation you look at. Tremendous cost saving for society and for the families. And so, when I interview neurologists, and they told me a sad truth about strokes, that you rather die to have long-term disability. It's lots of suffering for the families, for the one care for the patients. So this is the condition that we're talking about. And the government has set a lot of funds to facilitate treatment of stroke. But this is even better. We can prevent that. We can prevent the strokes from happening. So the context of this customer, it's a typical setup in our installation. It's a regional setting. We have full coverage of roughly 500,000 population. One university hospital, which, by the way, to be the best university hospital in Sweden for 2 years, and regional hospital and the primary care centers, about 30 of them. And the peculiar thing in AF is that most patients, they don't meet a cardiologist. We know in our system, in average, they meet the healthcare system 3 to 4 times per year. This AF patients population, about 8,000 to 9,000 in total. And they have encounter with the GPs. They come in, to refill diabetic drugs. They come with a flu, with something else. But they don't come to the cardiologist. And as they get older, the risk factor gets up. If they pass 65, if they have new condition of diabetes. So maybe, they are not in a recommended group for anticoagulation in the beginning. But over time, they're going to cross a threshold. They should be put on anticoagulation. Do you really think the GP will remember that? When they meet the old lady that come to refill the diabetes drugs and complaining about her bad sleep, having side effects of medication and talking and so on, you have 10 minutes. And that's the chance you have to help this patient. She might get stroke next day if you don't put anticoagulation in place. And that is the kind of the context of our CDS. And in terms of knowledge dissemination, it's very minute. When I met the senior cardiologist who's responsible for AF guidelines in the entire region, he's the one translating European guideline to Swedish, put that on the patient portal, and hoping everyone are going to use that. And he's a very responsible cardiologist. He uses his spare time to make phone calls to primary care centers and having workshops with them, with or without wine after work. And it's not very effective. People simply don't show up. It's very hard to disseminate that knowledge. Even though we know it's a critical case, it's very, very important. And he has a vague feeling, and that was about 2012, in the beginning of that year, that he told me that he has intuition that most patients are undertreated. More than 50% of patients undertreated. And that's where we get started here. But he doesn't know how many are undertreated. So we did a compliance checking using 2010 version, not 2012 version, and the compliance is 63%. I need to speed up a little bit here. So you can see that there's deviation, huge deviation, between the cardiology department and the geriatric department and surgical department in terms of the compliance of stroke prevention in AF. And you can see that even between the regional cardiology department and the university hospital. And because of this risk stratification instrument, we can estimate how many stroke will we get in a year for those non-compliant patient group in AF. We end up with 152 patients. And keep in mind, Östergötland, Linköping area, is 20th of whole Swedish population. So this match, quite nicely with the figure done by Lev, the cardiologist, predicted 3,000 preventable strokes. And again, tremendous cost saving. So this is the dashboard. We can pinpoint at where you want to measure. We can even look at, in this case, the age group and the gender group, and look at the compliance of the whole region. We can even go down to unit level. We can compare units. We can follow the trends over time, and that's the feedback loop I talked about. And this is the real-time CDS. Unfortunately, I will not have time to explain this, but this is the real-time CDS we put at a point of care and integrate that seamlessly with our EHR system on the ground. So that's the intervention. We want to catch those patients. When non-compliance is detected, you get an alert, you follow the guideline, you make a guided decision. You get, this is input from the EHR. You have the compliance checking, sorry about the Swedish here, and the risk calculation, and you can have recommended treatment. Then you have to make a decision. And that's the CMO, the chief physician of the region told me. They have to make a stand. You can't just, pretend you don't know about this. You just let it go. You have to make a stand when you reach this point. You give or not give. If you deviate from the guideline, you have to specify why. You have to make a standpoint that this is a critical condition. This will impact patient, impact the society. You have to make a decision. And of course, there are patient preference. Everything is taken into consideration. But you have to document what you have done. When you do that, a documentation fully structured is generated. And we map that actually quite nicely with the quality registry. So the next version, we are going to report this automatically to the registry. Do away with manual entries and so on. And when we develop these things, they're developed outside our EHR system, which means that we can deploy this on top of any EHR system, when we reach a new region where our EHR system is not on the ground. And this answers your question about, interconnection and chaining of the rules. And the yellow boxes are the archetypes. So their arrows go into the green shapes, and they are the rules. So we have 6 rules behind the previous screen, for the entire CDS application. And the purple ones are the templates that are more specific for the CDS. As you can see, I don't have the time to explain everything, but if you look at Charles-Vask score, which is a very neutral archetype, so that is the outcome for the calculation of the Charles-Vask score, but also input to 2 rules, risk calculation and stroke prevention compliance checking. So that's how we connect these things. We use archetypes as an intermediate placeholder of information. So we can forward chaining these things. And then we can combine this for more complex decision making. Yeah. I mean, of course, you have a question, we can always have an offline demo. I can explain the details. And we have, the software behind this to generate this kind of diagram. So it's automated service as part of the knowledge manager. So this is the archetype. It's not very controversial. I can't imagine that Norway want to have a different archetype for their Charles-Vask. It doesn't make any sense for me. Of course, we want to share, and this is the template for stroke prevention review. So at a point, every 6 months or every 12 months, you have to review the situation with AF management. And this is part of that, stroke prevention. And you have to give a reason why you deviate. And that is synchronized with the quality registry. So to summarize, I hope I still have time to summarize this. What we want to achieve here is that we start with the computerization of narrative guidelines with documents, templates, and rules, and in the future, order sets and process. Then we can disseminate quickly, we can measure, we can quantify the situation and the reality. When we identify a problem, we can pinpoint at certain weakness in the process, or we can provide intervention. So that is what we want to do, and this is what we have achieved with strong informatics. And it's very much based on lots of work done by friends at the Open EHR Foundation. So this is my summary, and I have a very talented team behind this work. And the whole unit was established actually last year at Cambio with a sole focus on clinical decision support and knowledge management. So we have very flexible business model. We can move as fast as we can. And so this is our focus. This is the CDS and knowledge management. And another thing very interesting about my team is that it's very international. We have 5 nationalities in that team of 10 persons. Yeah. Thank you very much for your attention.